It's a funny thing about success, isn't it? You often picture it as this really tough individual battle to the top.
Right, like climbing a ladder by yourself.
Exactly. But what if the real secret to getting ahead wasn't all about grabbing opportunities for yourself, but about, well, actually giving them?
That does sound counterintuitive.
Think about Adam Rifkin, this incredible networker
Hmm.
in Silicon Valley. He built this huge web of contacts, not through, endless self-promotion,
No, how then?
but through years of just consistently helping people out. Little things, big things.
Huh, interesting.
Or consider those studies, the ones that found engineers who regularly assist their colleagues often end up being the most productive ones.
Okay, so generosity actually fueling success.
Yeah.
That's not the usual story we hear.
It really isn't. It kind of goes against that common idea that the world's a zero-sum game. If I win, you have to lose.
Yeah, that winner-take-all mentality.
But the material we're digging into today, it paints a much more, well, unexpected picture.
Right, and that's really the mission for this deep dive, isn't it? We're diving into this world of give and take based on Adam Grant's work.
Exactly. We want to figure out the different ways people approach this whole helping thing. Are they givers, takers, or maybe something in between? Matchers.
And really understand how giving can be, maybe surprisingly, an effective route to achieving your goals.
But also where it can go wrong.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's not just about being nice all the time.
Definitely not. There are pitfalls. And this isn't just fluff. It's based on some compelling stories and solid research. People like Daniel Gilbert, Kenneth Frazier, Teresa Amabile, they've all recognized the value in these ideas.
Okay, so let's jump in. Where do we start?
Well, one of the first things that really jumps out is this apparent paradox, especially in a high-stakes place like venture capital.
Oh, yeah.
We see this play out in the story of Danny Shader and David Hornick. Shader's a startup founder, lots of potential.
Good.
And he has two very similar investment offers on the table. One's from Hornick, a VC he genuinely liked, seemed like a good guy.
Right? And the other.
From a different investor, but the terms were basically identical. Money, conditions, all the same.
So naturally, you'd think he goes with Hornick, the guy he clicked with.
That's what you'd assume. But nope, Shader actually chose the other investor.
Really? Why on earth? If the deal's the same.
His reasoning was fascinating. He worried Hornick was too nice, too affable, as he put it.
Too affable.
Yeah. He thought Hornick wouldn't provide the tough, critical feedback, the pushback, that he felt his young company really needed to actually grow and succeed.
Wow. So being too nice was seen as a negative, a weakness.
It raises that fundamental question, doesn't it? Does being a generous person, a giver, mean you're automatically a pushover?
Especially in competitive fields.
Exactly. Shader's worry points to this perception, maybe a common one, that givers might lack, that, hard edge needed to thrive when things get tough.
Like they prioritize being liked over making hard calls.
Precisely. So that initial insight is maybe in some cutthroat environments, being perceived as too nice can actually work against you.
It really makes you pause and rethink, doesn't it, what it actually takes?
Yeah.
And that leads us to think about the potential downsides of seemingly selfless giving. We see this in politics, for example.
Yeah, the example of Samson and Trumbull is quite telling. Samson was deeply committed to Trumbull. They shared political goals.
Okay.
So to make sure Trumbull won against a candidate Samson really opposed, Samson did something pretty drastic. He pulled out of the Senate race himself.
He dropped out.
Dropped out and actively told his own supporters to vote for Trumbull instead. An incredibly generous move.
Which obviously cost him his own shot at the Senate.
Absolutely. And some people looked at that and thought, his concern for others, his generosity, it was a liability, a sign he wasn't tough enough for politics.
Like his giving nature was a disadvantage, a vulnerability.
Yeah, but then you contrast that with someone like Abraham Lincoln. He also dealt with rivals, fierce ones.
Right, but his approach was different.
Very different. He brought them into his cabinet. People who openly disliked him doubted him.
Why would he do that? Seems risky.
Lincoln's thinking, apparently, was that he needed the strongest men of the party, as he put it, to serve the country, even if they were his political enemies.
Talent over personal feelings.
Exactly. He saw their strengths were more important than his own ego. But interestingly, Lincoln himself saw a potential pitfall for givers.
Oh. What was that?
He recognized he had this tendency, maybe a vice he called it, of not being able to say no, taking on too much.
Setting boundaries. That's a classic challenge for givers, isn't it?
It really is. So you compare Samson and Lincoln. You see giving playing out differently. One seemingly penalized the other while strategically using even his rival's strengths.
It really highlights the contrast with the outright takers, doesn't it? Which brings us to, well, Kenneth Lay and Enron.
Ah, yes, Enron. Lay might have projected this image of success, maybe even generosity on the surface.
But underneath,
Underneath, the gap between the public image and the reality was just huge. He might have done some philanthropy, sure, but the investigation showed this consistent pattern of deeply self-serving behavior.
like what specifically?
Taking massive personal loans from Enron, using company jets and resources for purely personal trips, having staff run personal errands. It was extensive.
So the outward show doesn't always match the reality.
Not at all. It highlights that you really need to look at the underlying pattern, not just the occasional grand gesture.
And the timing of his stock sales? Wasn't that pretty bad?
Extremely. Selling off, what, over $70 million in Enron stock just months before the whole thing collapsed, saving himself while employees and investors lost everything.
Devastating. And it's interesting, didn't someone early in his career flag him as maybe too ambitious?
Yeah, a boss at Exxon years earlier. It's like there were these little warning signs maybe of that taker mindset way back then.
And his networking. It wasn't really about give and take.
Not in a genuine sense, no. It seems it was more about leveraging connections with powerful figures, the Bushes, the Clintons, primarily to benefit Enron and, by extension, himself.
A key difference then. Givers build networks, takers exploit them.
That seems to be a core distinction, yeah. And the consequences for others are often starkly different.
So how do we get better at spotting the difference between a genuine giver and a taker who just looks good? It's not always obvious.
No, it really isn't. Which leads to some fascinating research looking at something as seemingly simple as CEO photos in company annual reports.
Photos, really?
Yeah, photos. Researchers Chatterjee and Hambrick had this idea. They looked at how large and how prominent CEO photos were in annual reports.
And the theory was?
The theory was that takers, being driven by ego and self-promotion, would tend to feature themselves much more prominently, a sort of me-first visual signal.
Okay, that makes sense. So what did they find when they compared, say, John Huntsman Sr., known as a giver, and Ken Lay, before Enron blew up, obviously?
The difference was pretty striking. In Enron's reports from years before the collapse, Lay and also Jeff Skilling were consistently featured with large photos, often multiple ones right at the beginning, big presence.
And Huntsman?
His photo was much smaller, more understated. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, an excessive focus on the CEO's image could be a subtle red flag, a visual clue.
Almost like the bigger the photo, the bigger the potential problem down the line. Interesting. Okay, let's jump forward to today. Online social networks, LinkedIn, everything's so visible now. How has that changed things for takers?
Well, thinking about those visible signals, the transparency online has definitely made it harder for takers to hide. Reputations spread fast.
Right. Bad behavior is harder to conceal.
Exactly. And think back to Adam Rifkin, the networker we mentioned. He built his network by being a genuine giver over years and years.
Small acts adding up.
Precisely. Those consistent small acts of kindness built this incredibly strong, positive reputation that now precedes him online and offline.
And that reputation must really matter when it comes to, what do they call them? Dormant ties.
Yes, dormant ties. Those connections you haven't spoken to in a while, you might think they're not very valuable.
Yeah, like old colleagues or classmates you haven't seen in years.
But research by Levin and others found actually the opposite. These dormant connections can be surprisingly valuable. Great sources of fresh information, new perspectives, different opportunities.
Huh, why is that?
Because they're outside your usual echo chamber. And for givers, like Rifkin, reaching out to these dormant ties is just different.
How so?
Because of their history of helping without asking for anything back, they've built up this reservoir of trust and goodwill. So when they reconnect, people are generally happy to hear from them, more willing to help. It doesn't feel transactional.
It doesn't feel like, oh, great, what does he want now?
Exactly. It's not like someone's suddenly popping up out of the blue asking for a favor. That past generosity paves the way. Think about those LinkedIn connections you haven't messaged in ages, potentially a goldmine.
That makes total sense. That track record matters.
Okay, but let's tackle that worry we started with. Do givers actually finish last? Danny Shader worried Hornick was too nice to be effective. What does the research say about productivity? This is such a critical piece. There was a study by Flynn on engineers. And initially, yeah, it looked like the givers were well-liked, high status socially, but their individual productivity metrics were actually lower than the matchers, those who operate more on a quid pro quo basis. Give if you get.
So it looked like helping others was hurting their own output.
It seemed that way at first glance. But, and this is the really fascinating part, when Flynn dug deeper into the data,
What did he find?
he found that the engineers who were the most productive, the top performers, they were the ones who gave often and actually gave more than they received.
Wait, so the consistent givers were the most productive, not the ones who gave occasionally.
Exactly. The key wasn't just being a giver, but being a frequent, consistent giver.
Okay, what explains that? How does giving more lead to getting more done?
Well, by consistently helping out, these engineers built up a huge bank of trust and goodwill, not just with the people they directly helped, but across the whole team, even the organization.
So they had more social capital.
Precisely. Which meant when they needed help or information or support, they could tap into a much wider network. People were eager to reciprocate, to help them out.
Ah, so their generosity created this positive feedback loop.
Exactly. It created this reciprocal environment where their giving was ultimately rewarded with broader support, boosting their overall productivity in the long run. That initial dip, maybe seen in less frequent givers, was more than made up for.
That's a really powerful idea. Giving isn't a trade-off with your own work. Long term, it can actually fuel it. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Collaboration, creativity. How do givers fare there?
This is another area where givers seem to have an edge. Think about the contrast between someone like Frank Lloyd Wright,
The famous architect.
right, who, based on these accounts, seemed more like a taker in collaborations, versus George Meyer, who worked on The Simpsons.
Okay, Wright and Meyer. How do they differ?
Well, Wright, despite his genius, apparently often alienated his apprentices. He wasn't great at sharing credit, and some felt he hindered their own careers.
Not very collaborative.
Whereas George Meyer, incredibly talented, generated tons of ideas for The Simpsons, but often preferred to focus on rewriting, punching up scripts, making the show better.
Even if it meant someone else got the primary writing credit.
Exactly. He prioritized the collective success, the quality of the episode, over his own individual recognition. That's a classic giver move in a creative setting.
And does the research back this up? Do teams with more givers do better?
Yes, studies show that groups with more members who have that giving orientation tend to produce higher quality work and more of it.
And what about individual rewards? Promotions, raises?
Givers often find they earn more of those in the long run, too, because their collaborative contributions boost team performance, and that gets noticed.
Collaboration involves credit. And not everyone shares it well. We
Mhm.
saw that with Wright, maybe. What about Jonas Salk, the polio vaccine guy?
Ah, Salk. That's a really potent cautionary tale. He achieved something incredible, obviously, world-changing. But he seriously damaged his standing in the scientific community by failing to properly acknowledge the crucial contributions of others.
Like the people in his own lab? Or scientists before him?
Both, really. Researchers in his lab, plus those whose foundational work laid the groundwork for his vaccine, by essentially taking sole credit, or appearing to.
I have.
He was kind of shunned by many peers, never got a Nobel Prize, which many felt he should have shared. It shows the backlash that can happen when you act like a taker, even after immense success.
Really drives home the importance of acknowledging others.
Yeah.
Okay, now, when we talk about helping and understanding people, empathy comes up a lot.
It does. But the source material makes a really interesting distinction between empathy feeling with someone and perspective taking.
Perspective taking. What's the difference?
Perspective taking is more cognitive. It's about understanding someone else's thoughts, their beliefs, their point of view, even if it's totally different from yours.
Okay, so feeling versus understanding.
Kind of. There's that neat experiment with toddlers,
Okay.
where they have to give a researcher either broccoli or goldfish crackers.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. The researcher shows a preference.
Exactly. And even young kids can often pick up on the researcher's preference, even if it's different from their own. They can take that perspective.
Whereas Frank Lloyd Wright, going back to him, his apprentices felt unrecognized, exploited, maybe a lack of perspective taking there.
It suggests that, doesn't it? It wasn't just about not feeling for them, maybe, but not truly understanding their needs, their ambitions, their perspectives.
So understanding is key. And that leads to believing in people's potential, right? Like that accounting professor, C.J. Skender.
Skender, what a great example. A legendary professor who just seemed to have this profound belief in his students' abilities.
And his students went on to do amazing things like Beth Trainum, Reggie Love.
Exactly. His track record speaks for itself. It perfectly illustrates the Pygmalion effect.
The self-fulfilling prophecy idea.
Right. When leaders, teachers, whoever have high expectations for people, those people often rise to meet them. They perform better.
Like that famous study in elementary schools.
Rosenthal and Jacobson, yeah. And Eden's research in the military, same effect. High expectations from leaders led to better performance from trainees.
And this isn't just isolated anecdotes.
No, McNatt did a big analysis of many studies, confirming this effect holds true across all sorts of workplaces. Belief is powerful.
So how do you actually develop that potential? Belief is one thing, but...
Good question. Our sources mention Cattell's investment theory of intelligence. The idea is that interest is what really drives the development of talent.
Interest, not just raw ability.
Not primarily, no. Bloom's study of world-class performers, musicians, scientists, athletes found most didn't show exceptional raw talent as kids.
Really? What fueled them then?
Early interest and strong motivation, they got hooked on something early, and that drove them to put in the effort.
Which brings us back to Skender.
Exactly. His knack for making accounting, which, let's face it, isn't always seen as thrilling.
Understatement.
Making it engaging and interesting for students was probably key. He sparked that interest, which motivated them to work hard and develop their talent.
Belief and interest.
Yeah.
Powerful combo. Okay, let's switch to decision-making, especially when things go wrong. The sunk cost fallacy, that's a big one.
Oh yeah, the sunk cost trap. We keep pouring resources into something failing just because we've already invested so much, right? Time, money, ego.
Even when rationally, we should just cut our losses.
Yeah.
Like staying to the end of a terrible movie because you paid for the ticket.
Exactly. And research suggests our ego plays a big part. We don't want to admit we made a mistake. But here's something interesting.
What's that?
The sources suggest givers might actually be less prone to this fallacy than takers.
Really? That seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't givers feel more committed, less likely to bail?
You might think so. But look at the example of Stu Inman, the basketball GM. He drafted LaRue Martin really high, #1 pick.
Okay. Big
Yeah.
investment.
Huge investment. But Martin just wasn't performing at that level, and Inman, instead of doubling down because of the high pick, was willing to admit it wasn't working and cut his losses.
He didn't let the sunk cost dictate the future.
Exactly. He seemed less driven by ego, more by what was actually best for the team. And other research backs this up. Givers tend to be more receptive to negative feedback, more willing to adjust course.
So maybe their focus on the greater good makes them more rational in these situations. Less ego involved.
That seems to be the implication. They can step back and make the pragmatic call more easily. Fascinating, right?
Definitely. Okay, let's talk communication style. We usually think influence comes from being super assertive, projecting confidence.
Right, the power stance, the unwavering voice.
But the book talks about powerless communication. What's that about?
This is another really surprising finding. Powerless communication involves things that seem like they'd weaken your position. Asking questions instead of just stating facts. Using tentative language, maybe, I think, perhaps. Admitting weaknesses or things you don't know. Seeking advice.
That sounds, well, powerless. How could that increase influence?
For givers, it seems to work by building trust and rapport. It makes you seem more human, more approachable, less intimidating.
There's that story about the presentation to Air Force colonels, right?
Yeah. The first time, standard confident presentation didn't go great. Second time, the presenter used self-deprecating humor, admitted limitations.
And the feedback was much better.
Dramatically better. And think about Dave Walton, the trial lawyer with a stutter.
A stutter seems like a disadvantage for a lawyer.
You'd think, but he found it actually made him seem more vulnerable, more credible. The jury connected with him more.
So showing a bit of vulnerability can actually be a strength.
When it's genuine, yes. It breaks down barriers, makes you relatable. Constant, perfect strength can sometimes feel fake or unapproachable.
And this applies to sales, too. Selling isn't usually about seeming powerless.
Well, think about Bill Grumble selling HBO back in the day. He succeeded not by hard selling, but by genuinely asking questions, listening to customers, understanding their needs.
A giver approach to sales.
Exactly. Contrast that with maybe a taker just pushing the product. Or look at Kildare Scotto, the optician mentioned.
What about him?
His focus was truly on helping patients see better, finding the right solution for them, not just maximizing the sale. He was a giver.
And that worked better long term.
It seems so. And studies of pharmaceutical salespeople found that a giving orientation was the strongest predictor of top performance.
Wow. Not product knowledge, not closing technique.
Giving. And Don Lane, in advertising, using a softer, more tentative style when presenting creative ideas, it built trust with the creative teams.
So influence through connection, not force. Even in negotiation, seeking advice seems like you're admitting you don't have the answers.
But it can be incredibly effective. Look at Annie's story. She needed a transfer. Seemed impossible.
What did she do?
Instead of demanding, she sought advice from a senior person. And through that conversation, this totally unexpected solution emerged using the company jet.
No way.
Yeah.
Just by asking for advice.
Yeah. Well, Lundquist points out 4 benefits. 1, you learn things. 2, it makes the other person consider your perspective. 3, they become more committed to helping find a solution. And 4, it's flattering.
Huh. People like being asked for their expertise.
Exactly. So that powerless communication, seeking advice, it builds rapport, builds trust, and ultimately makes givers more influential, often without confrontation.
Appearing a little vulnerable is actually a strategic advantage. Okay, we've talked a lot about the benefits of giving, but it's not all sunshine, right? Burnout is real. Being taken advantage of is real.
Absolutely crucial point. And this is where the concept of the otherish giver comes in.
Otherish, not selfless.
Right. Successful, sustainable givers aren't martyrs. They're otherish. They care deeply about helping others, yes, but they also keep an eye on their own interests and well-being.
So it's not purely selfless.
Not necessarily. That study of caring Canadian award winners is fascinating. They scored high on caring, obviously, but they also scored higher than a comparison group on measures of self-interest like ambition, achievement, power.
So they're ambitious and generous.
Exactly. They want to make a difference, but they also want to succeed themselves. Their own interests help fuel their giving rather than being sacrificed completely.
That makes sense. It sounds more sustainable. Like Conry Callahan, the teacher at Overbrook High.
Yeah, great example. She's feeling totally overwhelmed, burnt out from all the demands on her time.
So she stopped giving.
Nope. Her solution was actually to give more, but in a focused, structured way, mentoring students weekly. And counterintuitively, it actually increased her energy and sense of purpose.
By making the giving more impactful and manageable.
Precisely. And Haggerty's research with university fundraisers showed something similar. When the callers couldn't see the impact of their work, the givers among them actually performed worse.
They lost motivation.
Yeah. But when they connected them directly with students who benefited from the scholarships they were raising money for, boom. Motivation and productivity soared. Seeing the impact is key.
Which ties into that idea of chunking your giving, like Conry's weekly mentoring.
Exactly. It makes the impact feel more vivid, less like a drop in the ocean. And there's the tend and befriend idea, too.
What's that?
It's a stress response theory. Instead of just fight or flight, sometimes, especially under stress, people seek connection and support by helping others. Otherish givers seem to tap into this naturally.
So being otherish is actually the smart way to be generous long-term.
Okay, what about the really big rewards? Wealth, well-being.
Well, John Huntsman Cernier, the billionaire philanthropist, genuinely believed his giving made him rich.
How so?
He felt his drive wasn't just to make money, but to make money so he could help others, especially fight cancer. That purpose fueled his business drive.
And research backs this up, a link between giving and income. Arthur Brooks's research shows a correlation. Yeah. Higher income often correlates with more charitable giving. Huntsman called it an addiction for giving.
And beyond money, happiness, health.
Absolutely. Tons of studies on volunteering show giving time boosts happiness, life satisfaction, self-esteem, even lowers depression.
Physical benefits, too.
Yep. Things like lower stress hormones. It seems doing good feels good and is good for you. Richard Branson is another example, sees his philanthropy as a source of energy.
So the otherish approach creates this positive feedback loop. Helping others helps you, which helps you help others more.
That's the idea. It's sustainable in a way purely selfless giving might not be.
But,
Yeah.
let's talk about that doormat effect. How do givers avoid getting walked all over? Lillian Bauer's story is a bit worrying.
Yeah, Bauer, clearly talented manager, super helpful, but too generous, couldn't say no. People saw her as a pushover.
And it hurt her career?
Delayed her promotion, yeah. She fell into those classic giver traps. Too trusting, maybe too empathetic, too timid about her own needs.
But then you have Jason Geller at the same company, Deloitte, also a huge giver, nicknamed J-Nut because he connected everyone.
And his career took off.
So what was the difference? How did Geller avoid the doormat trap? The book mentions sincerity screening.
Right. Geller seemed to have this intuition, this ability to gauge why someone was asking for help. Were they genuinely trying to learn, to contribute? Or were they just trying to offload work or get quick fix?
So he didn't just help everyone indiscriminately.
He was still incredibly helpful, but maybe more discerning about how and where he invested his time. He wasn't just agreeable, he was genuinely helpful, but strategically so.
Like Peter Audit's story got taken advantage of early on because he was too trusting. It's about being savvy, not just nice.
Exactly. And distinguishing between being agreeable, just wanting to avoid conflict, and being a true giver who genuinely wants to help but is also aware.
And in negotiations, just feeling empathy isn't enough.
Apparently not always. Galinsky's research suggests perspective-taking, really understanding the other side's thoughts and interests, is more effective for reaching good deals than just feeling their emotions.
Interesting. And you can still be assertive as a giver, like Samir negotiating for his family.
Perfect example. He advocated strongly for his needs, but framed it around his family, maintaining that caring giver image. It worked.
I remember feeling that myself way back at Let's Go. Hesitant about sales, but reframing it as helping students find jobs. Suddenly, I could be much more assertive.
Exactly. You're advocating for others, or for a principle. And research shows these otherish negotiators who care about both sides winning are often the most successful.
Win-win. Okay, so being an effective giver is nuanced.
Yeah.
How do we create whole cultures where giving is the norm, not the exception?
Good question. Think about Craigslist versus FreeCycle. Craigslist is mostly transactional.
Buy, sell, done.
Right. FreeCycle is built around giving, community. And interestingly, even on FreeCycle, people who start out just taking often begin to give back. The environment encourages it.
So norms matter.
Hugely. Establishing that norm of giving, like Geller did with his network, or Rifkin, when helping is just what people do in that group, givers are protected. It's harder to exploit them.
It becomes the expected behavior. Now, the book touches briefly on that whole altruism debate. Is anyone really purely selfless?
Ah, the eternal question. Batson argues yes, pure altruism driven by empathy exists. Cialdini is more skeptical, suggests we help to reduce our own distress or guilt.
So even helping feels good for us.
Right. Or the idea of oneness. We help others because we feel connected to them, so helping them feels like helping a part of ourselves. Often it's probably mixed motives.
Does the ultimate motive matter as much as the action and the outcome?
That's a good philosophical point. But practically, the act of giving, whatever the motive, often builds trust. Like that consulting firm, Philippe's group, trying to win over Nouveau.
How did they build trust?
It wasn't working initially. They finally broke through when they just started offering valuable help and insights for free, no strings attached. Showed they genuinely cared about Nouveau's success, not just getting the contract.
Signaled they were givers, not takers.
Exactly. And speaking of signals, role models and social norms are incredibly powerful.
How so?
There was that experiment. Thinking about a generic superhero doing achievable good deeds was more motivating for volunteering than thinking about Superman, who's unattainable.
So relatable role models work better.
Seems so. And Cialdini's energy conservation work, telling people, most of your labors are conserving energy, was way more effective than just appealing to environmentalism or cost savings.
The power of the norm.
Yeah.
And showing heavy energy users they were outliers also got them to cut back.
Yep. Nobody wants to be the greedy one when the norm is conservation. Our behavior is hugely influenced by what we think others are doing.
Okay, one last big piece. Giving often involves receiving too. But asking for help. People are often really reluctant.
So reluctant. The research is clear. We consistently drastically underestimate how willing other people are to help us out.
Really?
Yeah, studies with the reciprocity ring, asking strangers to borrow a phone, asking for directions, even asking for charity donations. People are way more likely to say yes than we predict.
So we should just ask more.
Pretty much. Overcoming that hesitation seems key.
So if we want more giving, we also need to be better at asking and receiving. How can organizations encourage this whole cycle?
Well, things like the reciprocity ring work partly because they make requests public. Reputation matters, so even takers might act like givers in that setting.
Visibility helps.
It does. And that bank teller study showing giving behaviors correlated with promotions, though, again, for it to stick, you need that intrinsic motivation or visible impact.
So what else can organizations do?
Things like encouraging job crafting, letting people shape their roles to include more helping. Recognition programs that specifically reward giving, like that Send Love Love Machine. Promoting Rifkin's 5-minute favor idea.
Simple, quick ways to help.
Exactly. Creating easy opportunities for small, meaningful acts. Nipun Mehta's smile cards, things like that. Making it easy and visible.
And these don't have to be grand gestures, right?
Not at all. Buying someone coffee, offering useful feedback, making an introduction, backing a small Kickstarter project, lending a few bucks on Kiva, small acts add up.
They create that culture.
They really do. Every little bit contributes to a more positive, collaborative environment.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What's the big takeaway from this deep dive?
I think it's that giving, maybe surprisingly, can be a really powerful path to success, but it's not naive. You need to understand the styles, giver, taker, matcher, and the pitfalls.
And that otherish approach seems critical, balancing generosity with your own well-being and awareness.
Absolutely. It's about being strategically generous, perhaps,
Mhm.
caring for others and yourself. It sustains the giving.
It really flips the script on that old cutthroat model of
Mhm.
success, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests lifting others up is often the best way to lift yourself up, too. The motivations are complex, sure, but the benefits, personal, professional, for the community seem pretty significant.
So a final thought then for everyone listening. Take a second to think about your own style. Are you mostly a giver, a taker, a matcher? No judgment, just awareness.
Yeah, and then maybe identify one small, otherish thing you could do this week, something that helps someone else, but maybe also aligns with your own goals or well-being in some way.
A 5-minute favor, an introduction, some feedback.
Exactly, just one small thing, and see how it feels, see what happens, reflect on that impact.
Great challenge. We really hope this deep dive gave you some useful insights into the surprising power of giving. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you. It's definitely given us a lot to think about, too.